You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
Some houses are built to be homes, but others are built over something far worse. When the Whitman family built their dream home, they thought they were creating a new beginning. But what they didn't know was that they were building on cursed land that had been hiding a terrifying past for over a century. Beneath the soil were graves that were never meant to be disturbed, spirits that had been trapped, silenced, forgotten. And when the Whitmans ignored the warnings, the land decided it was time to wake up. The past refused to stay buried, and the house, it was never really theirs to begin with. The land never forgets, the land never forgives, and the White House of Horror is not finished. Subscribe now, if you dare. The Whitman family had always dreamed of building a home from the ground up, a place they could truly call their own. For years, they had lived in the bustling city of Philadelphia, where the noise never stopped, and space was a luxury they could never afford. John Whitman, a successful architect, and his wife Sarah, a real estate developer, had spent over a decade flipping homes and moving from place to place. But after the birth of their daughter Lily, they longed for stability. They wanted a fresh start, away from the city's chaos. When they stumbled upon a 5-acre lot on the outskirts of Blackwood, Pennsylvania, it seemed perfect. The town, though small, had a rich history. Once a booming coal mining settlement, it had settled into a quiet, almost forgotten community. The Whitmans saw potential in its quaint charm. Old brick storefronts, a single diner where everyone knew each other's names, and a dense stretch of untouched forest that wrapped around the edges of town. But there was one problem. The lot they had fallen in love with was already occupied by an abandoned house. The house no one would claim. The house was a crumbling relic of the past. Hidden behind an overgrowth of trees and ivy, the old bungalow had been standing for over a century, untouched and unwanted. Its wooden siding was warped and splitting, the roof sagged under the weight of years, and its windows were like empty, unblinking eyes, staring at anyone who dared approach. The townsfolk never spoke of the house unless they had to. Some called it the Grey House, others just the Cursed Place. Rumours about it had circulated for as long as anyone could remember. Some claimed that a family had lived there once, but they vanished overnight. Others whispered about a woman who died inside, waiting for someone who never came. Whatever the truth was, one fact remained. No one had dared to live there in nearly 70 years. Sarah had asked around town, hoping to get the full history, but met resistance. Old Mr. Hewitt, who owned the general store, had been the most forthcoming. "That house has bad bones," he had muttered under his breath. "I don't know what's in there, but people who go poking knock around don't tend to stick around long." But the Whitmans weren't easily deterred. They weren't superstitious. To them, the bungalow was nothing more than a decaying structure. They had the land surveyed, and after finding no legal claims to the property, they bought it at an unbelievably low price. Sarah, ever the optimist, called it a steal. John, meanwhile, was already designing their future home, a modern white mansion with expansive glass windows, a minimalist design, and an open floor plan. It would be the perfect contrast to the past that haunted the land. Construction was set to begin immediately, but from the first day, things did not go as planned. The first omen. The demolition crew arrived on a brisk October morning. The sky was grey, and the air carried the sharp scent of approaching rain. Joe Martinez, the head contractor, led his men to the site, feeling an unshakable sense of unease. He had worked on dozens of demolitions, but something about this house made his skin crawl. As the excavator rolled onto the lot, its massive arm extended toward the house. A murder of crows suddenly erupted from the treetops. They circled above in a chaotic frenzy, their sharp cries echoing through the air. The machine operator hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Just birds," Joe called out. Let's get moving. With a groan of metal, the excavator's claw gripped the first section of the bungalow and pulled. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. A cloud of dust and decay billowed into the air. Then the screaming began. Not from the workers, but from the house itself. A long, wailing moan echoed through the structure, vibrating through the walls like the death rattle of something old and unseen. The workers froze, eyes wide, as the sound faded into the wind. "What the hell was that?" one of them muttered. Joe forced a laugh, though his hands trembled. "Just the wood settling. This place is ancient." But deep down he wasn't so sure. That night, when Joe returned home, he received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, static filled the line, followed by a whisper so faint he could barely make it out. "You shouldn't have torn it down." Then silence. Joe Martinez sat in his truck outside the demolition site the next morning, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He hadn't slept. The voice from the phone call, "You shouldn't have torn it down," echoed in his head. He had worked in construction for 20 years. He had seen accidents, injuries, and places that felt off. But never like this. The bungalow had been more than just an old house. It had fought back. That scream, he wasn't the only one who heard it. And the call, no one had that number except his crew and his family. When his men arrived, he barely gave them a glance. Instead, he walked straight to John Whitman, who was reviewing blueprints near the remnants of the demolished structure. "I'm done," Joe said. John looked up, frowning. "What do you mean you're done?" Joe sighed. "Look, I don't know what's going on with this place, but it's not normal. My guys don't want to work here. Hell, I don't want to work here. That house, it didn't want to come down." John scoffed. "That's just superstition." "Maybe," Joe muttered, running a hand through his greying hair, "but I trust my gut, and it's telling me to leave. Find another crew, Whitman. I'm not sticking around to see what else happens." He left without another word, ignoring the confused and anxious expressions of his men. By the end of the day, most of them had quit, refusing to return to the site. No one wanted the job. John and Sarah spent the next week trying to find a new construction team, but word had spread fast. The locals wanted nothing to do with the job. "We don't work on that land," one contractor told them over the phone before hanging up. Another flat-out refused, muttering, "Some things are better left alone." Even when they offered above-market rates, no one in Blackwood would take it. Frustrated, Sarah suggested looking for workers outside of town. "It's just a house, John. We've built on old properties before." John, who had always prided himself on logic, agreed. He contacted a firm in Philadelphia, promising them full pay up front if they could get a crew out within the week. Money talked. By Monday, a team of workers from out of state had arrived, oblivious to the warnings that had driven the locals away. The heavy feeling. From the moment the new workers stepped onto the site, something felt wrong. The air was thick, almost oppressive. Even on clear days, it felt as though a storm was about to break, the air charged with something unseen. The scent of damp earth and decaying wood lingered, even though the old bungalow had been removed. Some of the men felt lightheaded after only an hour of work, their stomachs twisting as if they had eaten something rotten. Others swore they heard whispers carried on the wind, though no one could make out the words. The site supervisor, Alex, dismissed their complaints. "It's just nerves. You guys are letting the locals get in your heads." But even he couldn't ignore the way their tools kept going missing, only to turn up in strange places. A hammer buried in the dirt. A power drill left inside a hole they hadn't even dug yet. One worker, a tall, burly man named Dan, refused to come back after his first day. "I don't care about the money," he told Alex, stuffing his tools into his truck. "Something's here and it doesn't want us building on this land." 2 others followed his lead. Still, John and Sarah pushed forward. They weren't about to let ghost stories derail their plans. Then came the discovery. The unearthed chamber. It happened while digging the foundation. The backhoe hit something solid, not rock, but something man-made. The workers cleared away the dirt to reveal a set of stone stairs leading downward. The steps were old, carved from crumbling limestone, barely wide enough for a person to descend. They led into darkness. John, ever curious, insisted on going down. "It's probably an old root cellar," he said, waving away the workers' protests. Might even be worth something. Alex and 2 of his men followed, flashlights cutting through the blackness. At the bottom of the steps, they found a room. Small, no larger than a walk-in closet. The air was thick with the scent of rot and damp stone. The walls were lined with strange carvings, symbols none of them recognized, and in the centre of the room sat a coffin. It was primitive, wooden, long since rotted in places. The lid was slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to open it but never finished the job. John hesitated before reaching for the lid. "We should call someone," Alex muttered. John ignored him. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid. Inside, curled in a fetal position, was a skeleton. But it wasn't just the bones that made the men recoil. It was what the skeleton was wearing. A decayed wedding dress. The fabric had yellowed and rotted, but the shape was unmistakable. The bones of the fingers were curled around something. A rusted locket. No one spoke. A cold wind rushed through the chamber, though there was no way for air to get in. Then the flashlight in Alex's hand flickered. The light wavered, dimming before going out entirely. The others did the same. Pitch darkness swallowed them, and then a whisper. So faint, so close. You shouldn't have torn it down. John and the workers bolted up the stairs, scrambling out of the pit like animals fleeing a predator. None of them stopped running until they were far from the hole, panting and drenched in sweat. No one went back down there again. The next morning, Alex quit. The warning John refused to believe what had happened. It had to be some kind of coincidence, an old burial site, nothing supernatural. Sarah wasn't so sure. "John, we found a coffin buried under our house, and that whisper, everyone heard it." John didn't answer. By now, word had spread to the remaining workers. Some left immediately. Others stayed, but refused to go near the hole. Against Sarah's protests, John ordered the chamber filled with concrete. "If it's a grave, we'll treat it like one. We cover it and move on." By the end of the week, the foundation was poured, sealing whatever lay beneath. But as the concrete set, a single crack formed. Thin at first, almost invisible, but over time it would spread. John Whitman was a practical man, but even he couldn't ignore what was happening at the site. With Alex gone and nearly half the crew quitting after the burial chamber was discovered, he had no choice but to take drastic action. He doubled the workers' pay. It was an offer too good to refuse, even for those who felt uneasy. The ones who remained were mostly outsiders, people who didn't care about Blackwood's superstitions. Money spoke louder than fear, and John was willing to spend whatever it took to see his dream home built. And for a while, it seemed like things were settling. Once the burial site was sealed with concrete, the heavy, oppressive air seemed to lighten. The constant whispers and flickering lights ceased. The workers still refused to go near the sealed chamber, but progress was finally being made. The frame of the house went up. Walls were installed. The modern glass windows that John had envisioned gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the grim past that had been buried beneath the earth. It felt like they had moved past the strange occurrences. But then the accidents began. The first fall. The first incident happened 2 weeks after the burial site had been sealed. A worker named Miguel was installing beams on the second floor when he suddenly lost his balance. Witnesses swore they saw him stumble as if something had pushed him. He tumbled off the scaffolding, landing with a sickening crack. When the paramedics arrived, Miguel was conscious, but in shock. His injuries weren't as bad as they should have been, a broken arm and a mild concussion. But he kept muttering the same thing over and over. "She was there. She was right behind me." When asked who he was talking about, he refused to answer. John, frustrated but unwilling to admit anything supernatural was happening, chalked it up to worker fatigue. He gave everyone the rest of the day off, but made it clear, "We're finishing this damn house." Tools going missing. Over the next week, strange inconveniences slowed progress. Tools vanished from locked storage containers, only to reappear in places they shouldn't be, on the roof, inside unfinished walls, buried in the dirt. Power tools stopped working for no reason, only to function again when left untouched for hours. One morning, the foreman arrived early and found all the construction materials stacked in odd formations. Piles of wood forming strange spiral patterns, nails embedded into the ground as if arranged deliberately. "Someone's messing with us," he told John. John wasn't so sure. The voices returned. By the time the electrical work began, the whispers had returned. Electricians reported hearing faint voices inside the walls, like murmurs of a conversation happening just beyond their reach. A few of them even claimed the wires they had just installed were gone when they returned the next day. One worker swore he heard a woman crying behind the drywall. When he put his ear against it, he felt something cold press against the other side, like a hand reaching back at him. He left that night and never came back. The flooded basement. The final straw came just before the drywall was finished. One morning, the crew arrived to find the basement flooded. A foot of dark water filled the entire lower level, stagnant and reeking of rot. The plumber on site was baffled. The pipes haven't even been installed yet. There's no way this should be happening. But when they pumped the water out, they found something worse. Scratched into the concrete foundation beneath the murky waterline were words. "Let me out!" John stared at the message for a long time, his mouth dry. The workers refused to go back down there. Moving forward, no matter what. John knew he couldn't afford another mass walkout, so he did the only thing he could. He paid more. He reassured the workers that it was just a prank, that they were imagining things, that they were letting ghost stories mess with their heads. Money kept them there, but the fear in their eyes never faded. Despite everything, progress continued. The floors were installed, the walls painted, the fixtures put in place. By early spring, the house was nearly complete. For the first time in months, John felt like he was winning. But he didn't know that the house had only been waiting, because the real horror wouldn't begin until they moved in. By the time summer rolled around, the house was complete, and it was breathtaking. The Whitman home stood in stark contrast to the land's eerie past. It was a masterpiece of modern design, white stucco walls with sleek black steel framing. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the sky, making the house seem almost weightless, like a vision rather than something built by human hands. A grand, open-concept entryway led into a vast living space with vaulted ceilings and polished marble floors that gleamed under the recessed lighting. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, featuring black granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and a massive island that looked out into the sprawling backyard. Upstairs, a long balcony stretched across the second floor, offering an uninterrupted view of the dense tree line that bordered the property. The master suite had its own private terrace, where John and Sarah planned to drink coffee in the mornings, watching the sunrise over their new domain. Everything about the house radiated luxury. It was the kind of home that belonged in an architectural magazine. If you didn't know what lay beneath it, you'd think it was perfect. Transforming the land. With the house complete, the next project was the landscaping. John had envisioned more than just a home. He wanted an estate. He hired one of the best landscape designers in Pennsylvania to transform the barren lot into something worthy of their new home. The property was completely reshaped. The tangled, overgrown weeds and sickly trees that once choked the land were removed, replaced with manicured lawns and winding stone pathways. Rows of freshly planted dogwoods lined the long driveway, their white blossoms glowing in the moonlight. A koi pond was installed near the house, complete with a small stone bridge. Near the back of the property, they created a garden with neatly arranged flower beds, a gazebo, and a stone fountain at its center. By the time they were finished, the estate was unrecognizable from the decaying ruin it had once been. The town of Blackwood loved it. The locals' change of heart. At first, the locals had been wary of the Whitmans' project. Many had been convinced that nothing good would come from disturbing the land. But as time passed and the house stood tall and beautiful, their fears seemed to fade. People who had once whispered warnings about the cursed place now admired it. They stopped on the road to take photos. They spoke about how wonderful it was that someone had finally brought life back to the forgotten lot. It was as if the past had been erased. No one mentioned the bungalow anymore. No one spoke of the burial chamber. No one asked about the things that had gone wrong during construction. It was easier to pretend it had never happened. The hidden graves. But John and Sarah hadn't forgotten, because as the land was being reshaped, the workers kept finding more bones. The first discovery came when they were digging the foundation for the koi pond, a set of small child-sized bones wrapped in decayed linen. John had been there when they uncovered them. He had stared at the small skull, at the brittle fingers curled in the dirt, and felt something inside him turn cold. "What do we do?" one of the workers had asked. John's answer had been immediate. "We cover it. No one talks about this." And so they buried it beneath the pond. 2 weeks later, another set of remains was found beneath what would become the gazebo. This time it was an adult skeleton, though unlike the first burial, this one had been tied. Ropes, long since frayed, still clung to the bones. Sarah had been the one to make the call this time. Cover it. Keep going. They found 4 more over the next month. Each one was hidden beneath something else: the fountain, the driveway, the flower beds. Each time, John and Sarah chose to bury the past rather than acknowledge it. By the time the final plants were placed, they had covered up at least 7 unknown graves. They told themselves it was over, that this time they had sealed the past for good, that the house was theirs now, that whatever had happened before would stay buried, and for a while it seemed like they were right, until they moved in. The morning the Whitmans officially moved in, the estate looked like a dream. The sky stretched wide and endless above the house, clear and soft blue, as if the heavens themselves were blessing their new beginning. The freshly laid sod in the front yard gleamed vibrant green, dewdrops clinging to each blade in the golden light of dawn. The koi pond reflected the rising sun in rippling gold and orange streaks, while the white dogwood trees lining the driveway swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, the house smelled new, polished wood, fresh paint, and the faintest trace of lavender from Sarah's favourite candles. Sunlight flooded through the massive windows, illuminating the marble floors and bouncing off the steel railings of the grand staircase. Every room was a picture of perfection, staged, pristine, and waiting to be filled with life. It was the kind of house that felt invincible. Sarah took a deep breath, standing in the open concept kitchen, hands resting on the cold granite countertops. "We did it," she whispered. "We finally did it." John, carrying a box through the hallway, paused and grinned at her. "Told you it would all work out." For the first time in months, they felt safe. But Lily saw things differently. Lily's game. Lily Whitman was 6 years old and filled with a quiet kind of wonder. She had always been different, introspective, thoughtful, often lost in her own world of imagination. While John and Sarah unpacked, she wandered the house, running small fingers along the smooth walls, trailing through rooms with wide eyes. It didn't take long before she found her favourite spot. At the end of the second-floor hallway there was a door that led to a small playroom, just for her. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were already filled with storybooks, plush toys sat neatly arranged on a white rug, and a large bay window overlooked the backyard garden. Lily loved it immediately. But she wasn't alone. The first time she felt it was subtle. A presence. Like the way you feel when someone is watching you from across a room, even if you can't see them. She wasn't afraid. She sat on the rug and began playing with her dolls, humming softly to herself. As she arranged them in a perfect little line, she felt a whisper of movement, like the air shifting just slightly behind her. Then a single doll toppled over. Lily turned, blinking at it. Carefully, she set the doll back up. A moment passed. Then it fell again. Lily giggled. "You're silly." And just like that, a game began. She started asking questions. "Are you a boy or a girl?" Silence. She nodded. "You don't want to say?" Still no answer. Then, ever so faintly, the rocking chair in the corner of the room creaked. Lily's lips curled into a small smile. "You are real." From that moment on, she had a new friend. Unseen, but always there. Over the next few days, Lily spoke often to her invisible companion. John and Sarah dismissed it as childhood imagination. After all, she had just moved into a brand new house, and it wasn't uncommon for children to make up imaginary friends. But Lily insisted it wasn't imaginary. "She's real," she told her mother one night at dinner. "She likes it here." Sarah, absent-mindedly cutting her steak, barely looked up. "Who does, sweetheart?" Lily chewed on a bite of mashed potatoes and swallowed. "The lady in my room." Sarah's knife stopped mid-cut. John chuckled. "Oh, yeah? What's her name?" Lily frowned, considering. She doesn't have one. Sarah forced a smile, exchanging a glance with John. Is she nice? Lily nodded. Yeah, but she's sad. That was the first time Sarah felt that the cold prickle of unease run down her spine. At first, it was small things. Lily's toys would be found rearranged in patterns too precise for a child's careless hand. Dolls that had been on one side of the room were suddenly on the other. Books were pulled from shelves and stacked neatly, though no one had touched them. The rocking chair in the playroom creaked at odd times, always when no one was looking. One morning, Sarah found Lily sitting cross-legged on the floor, whispering softly. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Lily looked up and smiled. Her. Sarah crouched down, forcing herself to stay calm. "What does she say to you?" Lily's expression darkened slightly, her small fingers curling in her lap. "She says the house isn't new." Sarah's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Lily shrugged, looking back toward the empty space beside her. "She says it's hers." That night, Sarah lay in bed next to John, staring at the ceiling. "It's just an imaginary friend," John said sleepily when she told him. But Sarah wasn't so sure, because when she had checked on Lily after their conversation, the little girl had been sound asleep, her stuffed animals tucked neatly beside her. And standing in the centre of the room, though Sarah would swear later that it had to be her imagination, was the rocking chair, gently swaying, back and forth, back and forth. For John Whitman, the house was a symbol of achievement. He had poured everything into it, his time, his money, his pride. He had fought through delays, setbacks, and superstitions, and now, standing in his immaculate dream home, he refused to believe anything was wrong. He worked long hours, often leaving before sunrise and returning late at night. His architecture firm was booming, thanks in part to the recognition he received for designing this very house. Clients from all over Pennsylvania sought his expertise, and the demand for his work grew by the day. But with success came stress. He barely had time to enjoy the house he had built. His shoulders carried the weight of bills, contracts, and deadlines, and by the time he came home, all he wanted was to eat, sleep, and escape. So when Sarah voiced her concerns about Lily's imaginary friend, about the strange things happening around the house, he dismissed it immediately. "She's sick, Sarah. Kids make things up." Sarah's face pinched in frustration. "This is different." John sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I know you've been spending a lot of time alone in the house, but you're letting your imagination get the best of you. We sealed everything up. The past is behind us." Sarah didn't push further. She knew it was pointless. John didn't want to see. Sarah's world, a change in purpose. Sarah had always been ambitious. For most of her adult life, she worked in real estate, flipping homes, managing properties, and thriving in a fast-paced world. But after Lily was born, something inside her shifted. She didn't just want to be a career woman, she wanted to be present. When they started building the house, she made a decision. She would step away from real estate and transition into something she could do from home. It was an opportunity to raise Lily, to be there for every milestone, and to focus on expanding their family. That was the plan, to settle into this house, to fill it with memories, to have more children. She had already begun looking into new career paths, writing, interior design consulting, maybe even opening an online boutique. She had options. She had dreams. But lately she found herself struggling to focus. It wasn't just the adjustment to staying home, it was the house. The silence was never quite silent. Shadows seemed to stretch longer in the late afternoon light, and Lily's friend, the lady in the room, was always present, remembering the land's secrets. Unlike John, Sarah hadn't forgotten what they had buried. The night before they moved in, she had stayed up, thinking about the graves beneath the land, the bodies they had chosen to ignore. John had justified it. Old land has old bones. Sarah had forced herself to agree. But now, standing in their perfect house, she felt something else, like they had built on stolen ground, like the past was still breathing beneath their feet. John's denial. John had no such concerns. To him, the past was a chapter closed. Yes, the construction had been difficult. Yes, they had found things that were unsettling, but that was months ago. The foundation was poured, the walls were built, the land was transformed. He had conquered it. And yet, every now and then, when he walked through the house at night, he would feel something unexpected. Not fear, not dread, but a wrongness. A flicker of movement in the corners of his vision, a cold spot where there shouldn't be one. A door that he swore was open when he left the room but now stood firmly shut. But he ignored it. He had to ignore it, because admitting something was wrong meant admitting he had failed. And that was not an option. The Whitman house had been peaceful for a time, at least on the surface. But beneath the bright, modern veneer, something was changing. It started small. Sarah would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was John, up late with work stress or moving between rooms for a midnight snack. But when she turned to check, John was always beside her, fast asleep. The footsteps would continue, slow, deliberate, moving across the hallway outside their bedroom, then stopping. Other times, she'd hear whispers, muffled and unintelligible, just beneath the level of recognition. When she'd check on Lily, she would find her daughter sitting upright in bed, staring into the dim corner of the room. "Lily," she whispered one night, stepping toward her. Lily turned, her small face calm, but her eyes distant. "She doesn't like you being afraid, Mommy." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Who?" "The lady," Lily said simply. "She says she doesn't want you to leave." Sarah swallowed hard. "What do you mean, leave? I'm not going anywhere." Lily just blinked at her, then lay back down, closing her eyes as if the conversation had never happened. But Sarah stayed up the rest of the night. The kitchen incident. The first real incident happened in the kitchen. Sarah had been cleaning up after breakfast, humming softly as she wiped the counters. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a warm glow. The house looked normal, safe. Then, without warning, every cabinet door flew open at once. Bang! Sarah let out a startled cry, stepping back so fast she nearly tripped. Dishes rattled inside the cupboard, some sliding dangerously close to the edge. The pantry door swung open on its own, the motion so sudden that cans tumbled onto the floor, rolling toward her feet. The kitchen island shook, as if something had slammed against it from underneath. Sarah's breath came in sharp gasps. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went still. The house returned to its perfect modern silence. Sarah stood frozen, heart hammering in her chest. From the hallway, Lily's small voice drifted toward her. "She's mad." Sarah turned sharply. Lily stood in the doorway, her tiny frame silhouetted against the light. "Who is?" Sarah managed to ask, though her throat was dry. Lily tilted her head. "She doesn't like the kitchen." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Why?" Lily shrugged. "She just doesn't." Sarah didn't tell John. She already knew what he would say. "You're exhausted, Sarah. You're imagining things." But she wasn't imagining it, because the next morning every single cabinet was open again. John's breaking point. John had been working late the night before, buried under paperwork and deadlines. He didn't have time for Sarah's growing paranoia. So when she told him about the cabinets, he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sarah, you probably forgot to close them." She stared at him, anger flaring. "You think I forgot to close every single cabinet in the kitchen? That I left the pantry wide open? That cans just rolled out on their own?" John exhaled sharply. "Look, I get it. You're adjusting to being home full-time. You've got extra time to notice things." Her blood boiled. "Noticing things? You think I want to believe something is wrong here?" John stood, his exhaustion breaking into frustration. "Sarah, this house, our house, is not haunted. We built this from the ground up. Nothing from before is here anymore." Sarah shook her head. "You don't know that." John clenched his jaw. "I do know that. We covered it. We moved on. And maybe you should too." Sarah's hands trembled. She wanted to scream at him, to remind him about the graves they had ignored, about the whispers, about Lily's friend. But she didn't, because deep down, she knew John wouldn't listen. So instead, she whispered, "What if we never should have built this house?" John's expression hardened. "That's ridiculous." Then he left for work, slamming the door behind him. The night the house woke up. That night, the house decided it had been silent long enough. Sarah had finally managed to fall asleep, exhaustion pulling her into restless dreams. Then, a loud crash from downstairs jolted her awake. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she sat up, straining to listen. Another crash, like heavy furniture being thrown. She turned to John, still asleep. Sarah slid out of bed, moving carefully toward the door. The hallway was empty, but she could hear something, whispers, coming from below. She gripped the railing, peering down into the darkness of the living room. The moonlight cast pale slivers across the furniture, but everything was still. Then, suddenly, the chandelier above the dining table began to swing. Not from a breeze, not from a subtle vibration. It swung violently, the heavy glass crystals clinking together like frantic wind chimes. Then the dining chairs scraped against the floor as if being pushed back by unseen hands. Sarah's breath caught. A new noise joined the chaos, something sharp, a scratching sound. She turned her gaze to the far wall. And there, in deep, jagged etchings, words were being carved into the drywall before her eyes. "Get out!" Sarah stumbled back, her hands clamping over her mouth to keep from screaming. Then Lily's voice, soft from behind her, "She doesn't want us here anymore." Sarah spun to face her daughter, but Lily wasn't afraid. She simply stood in the dim light, watching. And then, as if answering some silent command, the entire house went quiet. But Sarah knew the silence wasn't peace. It was waiting, because whatever was in the house wasn't done yet, and it had only just begun. Sarah didn't remember how she got up the stairs, how she reached the bedroom, or how she shook John awake with such force that he nearly fell out of bed, but she remembered his face when he saw the raw terror in her eyes. At first he was groggy, confused. "Sarah, what?" "The house," she gasped, still breathless. "Something is here." John sat up, rubbing his face, still caught between sleep and frustration. "Sarah, it's the middle of the—" Then he saw Lily, standing in the doorway, watching them, and for the first time he noticed how calm she looked, not afraid, as if she knew something they didn't. That was the moment something shifted in John. "Show me," he said, pushing the covers off and climbing out of bed. Sarah led him downstairs, her heart hammering. The chandelier was still swaying slightly, as if whatever had shaken it had just barely stopped. The dining room chairs were scattered at odd angles, some pushed back, others turned completely away from the table. And then there was the wall. The jagged letters of "Get Out" were still carved into the drywall, raw and deep, as if something had clawed them in. John stared. His mind struggled to make sense of it, to explain it. But there was no logical reason. No draft could do this. No faulty construction. Sarah crossed her arms, her voice trembling but firm. "You tell me this is nothing, John." For the first time since they moved in, John had no response. That night, he didn't argue when Sarah grabbed her laptop and started looking up paranormal investigators. The paranormal team. By morning, Sarah had found them. Holloway Investigations, one of the most well-known paranormal teams in Pennsylvania. They have dealt with high-profile hauntings across the state, their cases ranging from abandoned asylums to suburban homes that held dark secrets. Sarah left a voicemail at dawn, explaining everything. The whispers, the objects moving, Lily's friend, the message carved into their wall. She didn't expect a call back so soon, but within an hour, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, collected. "Mrs. Whitman, my name is Elliot Holloway. We need to talk." Elliot Holloway's warning. Elliot Holloway arrived that afternoon with his team, 3 others, all seasoned investigators. His reputation preceded him. He wasn't a television personality, not one of those ghost-hunting celebrities who exaggerated every shadow. He was methodical, analytical, and deeply respected in his field. Elliot was in his early 50s, sharp-eyed with greying hair, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a leather-bound notebook. He walked through the Whitman home with an air of someone who already knew what he was going to find. He didn't even need Sarah to explain much before he sighed, rubbing his jaw. "This land," he murmured, "has a history." Sarah and John exchanged glances. We know about the burial sites," John admitted. "But we didn't want to disturb them. We covered them." Elliot turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "You think covering something hides it?" he asked. John's jaw tightened. "What else were we supposed to do?" Elliot exhaled, shaking his head. "You should have left." The history of the land. Elliot had done his research. The moment Sarah's voicemail came through, he started digging into Blackwood's past. And what he found was worse than any of them expected. "This house," Elliot said, gesturing to the gleaming walls and modern architecture, "sits on land that used to belong to the Grey family." John stiffened at the name. "Eleanor Grey," he murmured, remembering the skeleton in the wedding dress. Elliot nodded. "Eleanor wasn't the only one who died here. Sarah swallowed. "We found other remains. We." She hesitated. "We didn't report them. We just kept building." Elliot's eyes darkened. "You buried evidence," he said. "You think the house is yours, but the land remembers." Then he told them what the records revealed. Over a century ago, the Gray family had owned a small estate on this very plot of land. The father, Samuel Gray, was a reclusive man, known for his obsessive religious beliefs and increasingly erratic behaviour. When his daughter, Eleanor, fell in love with a young man from a different social class, Samuel disapproved. On the night before her wedding, Eleanor's fiancé mysteriously vanished. Some say he fled. Others say Samuel made sure he never left the property. Eleanor spiralled into madness, believing her lover was still coming for her. She refused to leave the house, still wearing her wedding dress long after the wedding date had passed. And then, one winter night, she disappeared. Official records claimed she died of natural causes, but rumours in Blackwood said otherwise, that she was sealed away beneath the house, that her father had buried her alive. And worse, Samuel Gray wasn't the only one who kept secrets, because when the Whitmans uncovered multiple graves during construction, they weren't just finding random bodies, they were finding his victims. Samuel had spent years luring drifters, workers, and even townspeople to his land. Some he buried in secret, others he sacrificed in twisted rituals meant to purify his home. When Samuel finally died, his house, the old bungalow, sat abandoned for decades. The land, tainted by his horrors, was left untouched, until the Whitmans tore it down, until they built on top of it. Sarah felt sick. "You're saying, the things we're seeing, it's Eleanor?" Elliot hesitated, his gaze flickering to Lily, who sat quietly on the couch, swinging her legs. "I think Eleanor is part of it," he admitted, "but I don't think she's what you should be afraid of." The investigation begins. Elliot's team wasted no time. They set up motion-activated cameras, thermal scanners, and EVP recorders throughout the house. They mapped every cold spot, tested every creaking door. But the moment they entered Lily's playroom, everything changed. One of the investigators, a woman named Sophie, walked in and immediately stopped. She turned to Sarah, her expression unreadable. "You said Lily talks to a lady in here?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, why?" Sophie exhaled. "Because I think she's still here." Then, bang! Every single toy on the shelf flew to the floor at once. Lily, sitting on the rug, smiled slightly. "She just wants you to listen." Sarah barely breathed. "Listen to what?" Lily tilted her head, her voice soft. "She says you made a mistake." The room grew cold. The investigators braced themselves, because whatever was in this house was about to make itself known. The air inside the house had changed. Elliot Holloway and his team were seasoned professionals, but even they seemed tense as they set up their equipment throughout the house. Cameras covered every room. Motion detectors were placed at key points, doorways, staircases, Lily's playroom. And EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recorders were left running in the basement, hallways, and anywhere activity had been reported. Sarah, John, and Lily weren't allowed to leave. Elliot insisted they stay. "If something wants you gone, it's more likely to react when you're here," he explained. And react it did. The first sign came just after 10 p.m. One of the investigators, a tech specialist named Grant, was reviewing footage from earlier when the front door opened by itself. It didn't swing open with force. It unlocked first, an audible click, and then slowly creaked inward, as if someone were stepping inside, except no one was there. Grant, visibly shaken, rewound the footage and checked the timestamp. "Is this the same time you guys started feeling uneasy?" he asked. Sarah nodded. That was when she had been in the kitchen, and the temperature had dropped so suddenly that her breath came out in a mist. The cold spots and shadows. Throughout the night, the team tracked cold spots moving through the house. They weren't random. They were deliberate, travelling in slow, intelligent patterns. A cold draft would brush past John's arm, sending goosebumps up his skin, only for Elliot to turn the thermal scanner toward him and murmur, "Something standing right next to you." Even worse were the shadows. At least 3 different times, someone saw something move out of the corner of their eye. A figure, tall, thin, lurking in the hallway. At one point, Grant yelped and nearly dropped his camera. "Something just walked past the stairs," he said, his voice hoarse. "I swear to God I saw it." When they reviewed the footage, the camera had caught a dark mass shifting at the frame. No clear features, no face, just a shadow, watching. Lily's room. The worst activity happened in Lily's playroom. Sophie, the lead investigator, spent most of the night in there with an EVP recorder and a temperature gauge. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt different. Heavy, she murmured, shivering. She placed the recorder on the floor and turned on a small flashing device called a REM pod, designed to detect fluctuations in the electromagnetic field. "Is anyone here?" Sophie asked softly. Silence. Then, beep! The REM pod lit up in front of her, pulsing red. Sophie's breath hitched. "Can you make that stop?" Instantly, it stopped. She glanced towards Sarah and John, who stood in the doorway watching with wide eyes. Sophie licked her lips, heart pounding. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, through the EVP recorder, a static-filled whisper played back. "Let me out." The team went still. Sarah's stomach clenched. John's face went pale. That was exactly what had been carved into the basement concrete before they covered it. Then, Lily, who had been sitting cross-legged in the room, turned toward the corner. "She doesn't like you asking questions," she murmured. The moment she spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. The REM pod started beeping wildly. Sophie shot up, backing away as something invisible rushed past her. The air moved, a force so strong that Sarah's hair whipped around her face. The door to the playroom slammed shut. From the other side of the house, a light shattered. The haunting was no longer subtle. It was angry. The night together. By 2 a.m., no one felt safe alone. The team suggested that everyone sleep in the same room, the master bedroom. Lily curled up beside Sarah on the bed, tucked under her mother's arm. John sat on the other side, gripping her hand tightly, his body tense. The investigators set up cameras facing the bedroom door. No one spoke much. There was too much to process. John, for the first time, looked truly shaken. His fingers ran through his hair, his jaw clenched. "Sarah," he whispered, "we should leave." Sarah turned toward him, swallowing hard. "But what if it follows us?" John had no answer. Elliot sat nearby, his notebook open, reviewing everything they had witnessed. He exhaled, rubbing his eyes. "This isn't a normal haunting," he admitted. "This is something tied to the land, tied to you." Sarah shivered. "What does that mean?" Elliot hesitated. "You built over something that was never supposed to be disturbed," he said finally. "And now, whatever's here, it doesn't want to be ignored anymore." A tense silence filled the room. A loud knock, 3 deliberate knocks against the bedroom door. Boom, boom. Lily shifted in her mother's arms, whispering, "She's coming." The first sign that something was truly wrong was the smell. A deep, foul stench, like rotting earth and something far worse, began to seep into the master bedroom. Sarah clapped a hand over her nose, gagging. John recoiled, his face twisted in disgust. From the floor vents, something dark oozed up. A thick, black sludge seeped through the cracks in the marble floors, moving like it was alive. Then, the screaming started. Not from any of them. From the house itself. A high-pitched, inhuman wail echoed through the walls, a chorus of voices screaming in rage, in pain, in hunger. The investigators scrambled to their feet. Elliot's team rushed to grab their equipment, but it was too late. A loud crack splintered through the house as something burst up through the floor of the hallway. Bones. A twisted skeletal hand, rotted and splintered, reaching through the wood, clawing at the air. Then another, and then bodies. The graves they had buried were coming back. Throughout the house, the polished floors erupted, spitting out the remains of the forgotten dead. Rib cages, skulls, half-preserved corpses wrapped in wedding dresses, bound in ropes, tangled in tattered burial shrouds. The past was no longer beneath them. It was inside their home. Sarah grabbed Lily and ran. The fight to escape! John was shouting, as Elliot and his team scrambled to navigate the collapsing house. The walls buckled inward, the ceilings cracked, dust pouring down like rain. From the kitchen, cabinet doors slammed open and shut violently, throwing dishes and silverware into the air. A knife flew past Sarah's head, embedding itself into the wall next to her face. The house was trying to kill them. A deep, guttural growl. Not human, not even of this world. Lily clutched her mother's arm, whispering, "She says it's too late." Sarah didn't ask who she was, because she already knew. Eleanor. But Eleanor wasn't the one doing this. She had been a victim. This was something older, something worse. The land itself was rejecting them. Sarah turned toward Elliot, who was struggling to keep his balance as the house shook beneath them. "What do we do?" she screamed. Elliot's face was pale. His voice was hoarse with realization. "The bodies weren't supposed to be covered," he shouted. "They were supposed to be blessed." Sarah's stomach twisted. John's eyes widened in horror. The Whitmans hadn't honored the dead. They had silenced them, and now the land was taking everything back. The house implodes. The front door was gone, not shut, gone. Where the entrance once stood was now just blackness, like the house was folding in on itself, closing every escape. "We're trapped," Sophie cried, pulling at Lily, trying to shield her. Then a voice, low, hoarse, ancient. "Leave." The air rippled. The foundation screamed. And just as every grave erupted in full, spilling skeletons and rot into the house, Sarah felt a pull, like something grabbing them from behind. And then the Whitmans and the investigators were thrown out of the house. One moment, they were inside, surrounded by the dead. The next, they were outside, sprawled on the front lawn. Sarah gasped, clutching Lily, feeling cold earth beneath her fingers. John groaned next to her, coughing from the dust. Elliot's team scrambled to their feet, faces white with shock. And then the house collapsed. Not like a normal collapse. Not like something falling in on itself. It imploded. The glass windows burst inward, sucking into the black vortex that had once been their home. The walls folded, the structure shrinking, until nothing remained but a deep, gaping hole in the ground, like the house had never existed at all. The land wins. The silence afterward was deafening. Sarah sat frozen, Lily shaking in her arms. John was speechless. Elliot finally spoke, his voice grim. "It wasn't the house," he murmured. "It was the land all along." Sarah barely heard him. Her eyes were locked on the hole where their home had been, where the past had swallowed the present whole. And then Lily reached up, pointing. Sarah followed her gaze. Just beyond the wreckage, standing near the edge of the woods, was a figure. A woman, draped in a tattered wedding dress, her hair whipping in the wind, her face partially obscured by shadows. Eleanor Grey. Sarah's breath caught. But Eleanor wasn't looking at them. She was looking past them, toward the trees, toward something else. And then, before Sarah could blink, Eleanor disappeared. The twist. It's not over. Days later, investigators combed the site. Officials refused to believe what had happened. But the Whitmans knew the truth. Elliot warned them. The land was never meant to be disturbed. The bodies should have been blessed. But no one knew how many graves still remained. No one knew how deep the horror went. And as Sarah and John packed their bags, preparing to leave Blackwood forever, Lily, sitting in the back seat, whispered something under her breath. Sarah turned. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Lily's big, solemn eyes met hers. "She says it's not finished." Sarah's heart stopped. Lily looked out the window, her small hand resting against the glass. "She says there are more." Sarah followed her gaze, and in the distance, past the ruins of their once beautiful home, the trees swayed unnaturally as if something else was waking up, something older, something angrier. And Sarah finally understood. The house was only the beginning. The land wanted more, and it wasn't finished yet. 6 months later, the town of Blackwood, Pennsylvania had a way of forgetting things. For years, the old bungalow had sat untouched, avoided by locals, dismissed as nothing more than a relic of a forgotten past. When the Whitmans tore it down and built their modern masterpiece, the town had marveled at the transformation, choosing to ignore what had come before. And now, 6 months after the implosion, Blackwood was forgetting again. The official story was simple. A gas leak caused the collapse. The Whitmans had moved away after their tragic loss. No one spoke of the bodies found beneath the property. No one questioned the reports of strange occurrences leading up to the disaster. Just like before, the land was left alone, and the town moved on. A new beginning? But land, cursed land, never truly rests. The property sat empty, untouched by developers, its deep, gaping wound in the earth slowly closing as nature reclaimed it. But one day, a new sign appeared at the edge of the road. For sale. No mention of its history. No warnings. Just an opportunity waiting for someone new. A week later, a black sedan pulled onto the lot. A man in a suit stepped out, his sharp gaze surveying the land. He was a developer from out of town, eyeing the prime real estate for something new, perhaps an apartment complex. A hotel, something that could finally erase the past. He walked toward the edge of the property, standing where the Whitmans' house once stood. The wind shifted. The air grew thick. A faint whisper curled through the trees. "Go back." The man hesitated, looking around. Nothing, just the trees swaying too slowly, like they were waiting. He shook off the unease and pulled out his phone, dialing a number. "Yeah," he said. "I want the full survey done by next month. Let's get moving on this." He hung up, pocketing the phone. Then he heard it again. A rustling behind him. Not the wind, not the leaves. Something moving. He turned, and for just a second he saw her. A woman standing near the edge of the forest. Pale. Still wearing her decayed wedding dress. Her sunken eyes locked onto his. Her lips moved, a silent warning. And then she was gone. The man shivered, rubbing the back of his neck. He wouldn't mention what he saw. He wouldn't tell anyone about the cold breath on his skin, about the lingering whisper in his ear. Because men like him didn't believe in ghosts. And just like that, the cycle began again. The land never forgets. The land never forgives. The land is not finished. The White House of Horror will rise again. The land remains.
Every story has an end, but here the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.